The generator died at 0214 hours. 1 second the operating tent was lit. The next it was black, and I was standing over an open abdomen with my hands inside a man whose name I had learned 20 minutes earlier when they carried him through the flap on a litter covered in blood and dirt. 2 soldiers at the entrance with rifles, mortar fire every 4 minutes outside. My scrub tech holding a tactical flashlight over the surgical field with one hand and retracting tissue with the other. The patient's blood pressure dropping. The bleed I was trying to control still active. In that moment, with the generator gone and the light reduced to a single beam and the sounds of a firefight 60 meters away, I made 12 decisions in approximately 40 seconds. Clamp positioning, suture selection, the angle of approach to the vessel, whether to pack and close or continue the repair, whether the patient could tolerate another 10 minutes of surgery or whether I needed to finish faster and accept a less complete repair. I made all 12 decisions correctly. The patient survived. Later, when the fighting stopped and the power was restored and we were cleaning up, my stepdad's battalion medic found me outside the tent. He'd been inside watching. He held my gaze for a moment and said simply, "I've never seen anything like that." I wrote it down. Everything I write down eventually matters. I have never told my stepdad what I keep in the notebook I carry on every deployment. Not the entries about the 12-hour surgery days, not the ones about the mass casualty events where we triaged 50 soldiers in 2 hours, and I made the decisions about who could wait and who could not. Not the entry from the night his comment about military nurses being glorified hospital staff reached me through my mother's voice on a satellite phone, and I wrote it down in the dark with a headlamp while the fob was on lockdown. Some people would have called him, argued the point, listed credentials and deployments and statistics about how the survival rate for combat casualties had reached 92% in recent conflicts, in no small part because of what forward surgical nurses contributed to that number. I am not that person. I document. I wait. I let the work speak, and the work eventually speaks loudly enough that the rest becomes unnecessary. My name is Captain Sarah Mercer. I am an Army nurse with board certification in critical care and surgical nursing, a combat medical badge, 2 Bronze Stars, and 5 deployments to environments where the distance between a wounded soldier and the nearest operating table was measured in helicopter flight time, and we existed to close that gap. A forward surgical team nurse is not a hospital nurse deployed to a safe facility. A forward surgical team operates 20 personnel from a tent or a hardened building or the back of a vehicle, as close to the fighting as the mission requires, establishing a functional operating room within 90 minutes of arriving anywhere. We perform damage control surgery. We stop the bleeds that kill people before the medevac gets them to the next level of care. We make the decisions that determine whether a soldier survives the next 2 hours. We do it under fire, in the dark, with equipment that fits in the back of a truck, and we do it with a skill level that took years to build and that most civilians will never understand exists in the military at all. My stepdad, Robert Mercer, had been in my mother's life for 6 years, and in mine for 5. He was not a bad man. He was a retired Army infantry first sergeant who had served 22 years and developed in those 22 years a very specific and very fixed understanding of what military service looked like. It looked like a rifle and boots and a fighting position. It looked like direct engagement with the enemy. Everything else was support. Everything else was, in his framework, secondary, including medicine, including surgery, including the profession I had chosen and spent 8 years perfecting. The first time he made the comment, we were at dinner. My mother had mentioned I was being considered for deployment with a forward surgical element, and Robert had set down his fork with the deliberate patience of someone preparing to explain something obvious. "She'll be running an aid station," he said to my mother, as if I wasn't in the room. "IV starts and paperwork, that's what nurses do in the Army. Support role, nothing wrong with it." I was a first lieutenant at the time, 1 year out of the Army Nurse Corps basic course, already with 1 deployment as a surgical nurse behind me. I had spent that deployment doing pre-op and post-op care, scrubbing into trauma surgeries, learning the specific brutal medicine of combat casualties. Nothing glamorous, nothing he would have recognized as soldiering. I did not argue. I asked him to pass the potatoes and added an entry to the notebook when I got home. Date, location, exact words. The notation I wrote beside it was 2 words. Not yet. The second comment came 8 months later. My mother told him I'd been recommended for the forward surgical team pipeline, which involved additional surgical training, trauma simulation, mass casualty exercises. He'd nodded with the slow patience of someone who had already categorized this information and found its place. "That's a good career path for nurses," he said. "Steady work, safe environment, good benefits when she gets out." Safe environment. I was being trained for a 20-person surgical team that deployed within range of active combat to perform emergency surgery on casualties who would die if they waited for transport to a full hospital. Nothing about it was a safe environment by any reasonable definition of those words. I noted it. I waited. The third comment is the one that stayed with me longest. I had been home on leave after my second deployment with the forward surgical team. We'd had a mass casualty event midway through the deployment, a vehicle-borne IED at a checkpoint that produced 11 casualties simultaneously for a team equipped to handle 6. I had worked for 19 consecutive hours. I had been the circulating nurse on 4 surgeries that day and had stepped into a scrub role on a 5th when our scrub tech needed to rotate out. I had triaged 7 soldiers in the first 40 minutes of the event, making the decisions about priority of care that determined who went to surgery first and who waited. 3 of those soldiers were alive because of decisions I made in that triage. 1 was not alive, and that was also because of a decision I made. The decision that his injuries were not survivable, and that the resources required to attempt salvage would cost lives that were salvageable. I made that call correctly. I know this. I also carry it, the way everyone who makes those calls carries them. I was home on leave 2 weeks after that deployment, sitting in my mother's kitchen with the specific kind of fatigue that is not tiredness, but the absence of the adrenaline that had been holding everything up for 6 months. Robert came in from the yard and looked at me and said, "How was the hospital work?" Not the deployment, not the service, hospital work. As if I'd been staffing a ward somewhere, administering medication and updating charts. I said it was fine. I went home that evening and wrote 6 lines in my notebook. 6 lines that included the words hospital work, and the date and the time, and a description of what I had been doing in the 24 hours before he said it. I wrote it all down, precisely and without emotion, the way I wrote everything down. And I closed the notebook and went to sleep and went back to work when my leave was over, because that is the other thing documentation teaches you. The work is always the answer. The work is the only thing that actually changes anything. My forward surgical team deployed to eastern Afghanistan for my 4th time in the region on March 7th. We set up at a forward operating base in Helmand Province, a 9-person split element, which meant we were operating as half a team to extend coverage across a wider area. 2 surgeons, 2 nurses including me as senior nurse and de facto clinical lead when the surgeons were in the OR, 1 CRNA for anesthesia, 3 medics, 1 surgical tech. 20 people reduced to 9, covering a combat zone the size of a large county with an operating table, a generator, a supply of blood products that had to be carefully rationed, and the collective expertise of a team that had trained together for a year before this deployment. Robert's battalion had been in the province for 4 months before we arrived. I knew this before I deployed. My mother had mentioned it. I had noted it without particular significance. My stepdad's battalion was one of several units operating in our coverage area. This was geography, not destiny, except that it became destiny on the night of April 22nd, when his battalion conducted a clearance operation in a valley 12 kilometers from our FOB. I will tell you what happened to Robert Mercer on April 22nd the way it came to us, not the way he told it later, because the way it came to us was the only way that mattered to the medicine. The radio call came in at 2147 hours. Medevac request, medevac request. This is Bravo 26. We have 2 urgent surgical casualties from IED strike. Grid follows. The grid put them 20 minutes out by helicopter. Our senior surgeon, Major Chen, was already moving toward the OR tent when the call came in. I was right behind him. "Talk to me on the casualties," I said to the radio operator. "First casualty, 34-year-old male, blast injury, left leg amputation below knee, tourniquet applied, Second tourniquet applied. BP 80 over pulp last reading, conscious and combative. Second casualty, 56-year-old male, blast injury, abdominal penetrating trauma, BP 92 over 60, unconscious, GCS 8. 56. That was older than typical for an infantry casualty. I noted it without processing it as anything other than a clinical data point. High-velocity penetrating abdominal trauma in a 56-year-old with a GCS of 8 and a BP of 92 over 60. That was a hemorrhagic shock patient with a compromised airway. That was my first patient when they came through the flap. I started preparing for that patient. The medications, I made that call correctly. I know this. I also carry it, the way everyone who makes those calls carries them. The blood products, the assessment protocol. I did not think about who he was. I thought about what he needed. The helicopter landed 19 minutes after the call. Both patients came through the entrance simultaneously on litters, held by medics who were shouting vitals and mechanism of injury and interventions already performed. The younger soldier, the leg amputation, went to my medic immediately for continued hemorrhage control and stabilization. I took the second patient. 56-year-old male, penetrating abdominal trauma. The tourniquet that had been applied uselessly to his midsection because his medic had been trying to stop bleeding that couldn't be stopped with external pressure. I cut his uniform away with trauma shears and did my assessment in 45 seconds. Penetrating wounds, multiple, right lower quadrant and flank. Distended abdomen indicating internal hemorrhage. BP dropping. Airway compromised. GCS now 6. I need a surgical airway kit and type-specific blood now, I said to my tech. Then I looked at his face for the first time, Robert Mercer, my stepdad. 22 years of infantry service. The man who had called my deployment's hospital work. Lying on my surgical table with his abdomen filling with blood. I looked at his face for 1 second. One deliberate, conscious second in which I allowed myself to recognize him, and to feel whatever that recognition required, and then I set it aside completely, the way you have to set aside everything that isn't the medicine when the medicine is the only thing keeping someone alive. I know this patient, I said clearly, for the record, for the documentation. He is my stepfather. I am proceeding with care. If anyone believes my judgment is compromised, speak now. No one spoke. Because no one in that tent had seen anything from me in 4 years of working together that suggested my judgment was compromised, and because the alternative was watching a man bleed to death while we located a different clinician. Major Chen is on the primary OR case, my tech said. You're the senior available provider. I know, I said. Let's get him intubated. The next 4 hours were the most technically demanding of my career. Not because the injuries were uniquely complex, though they were complex enough, because the conditions degraded in 3 separate ways while I was managing a patient who had lost 2 units of blood before he arrived and was losing more. The generator failed at 0214. We switched to tactical flashlights and kept going. Our blood product supply ran critically low at Aero 240, and I made the decision to shift to whole blood protocol using the walking blood bank we maintained, drawing from pre-screened team members. The surgical tech who had been helping Major Chen in the primary OR came to me at 0310 to report that Chen had finished his case and was scrubbing in to assist, which meant I had support for the final phase of the repair. But for the first 2 hours, it was primarily me. And Robert's battalion medic, Specialist Torres, who had accompanied the casualties and who had been watching everything from the moment they brought his battalion commander through the flap. I should explain what damage control surgery requires a nurse to do on a forward surgical team, because the nurses aren't real soldiers framework depends on a misunderstanding of what the role actually involves. On a forward surgical element, the nurse is not a support function. The nurse is a clinical decision maker. In the absence of a surgeon, which happens when the surgeon is occupied with another critical patient, the nurse manages the resuscitation and makes the judgments about when intervention is required and what form that intervention takes. The nurse maintains the patient's physiology while the surgeon operates. The nurse catches the things the surgeon cannot see from inside the operative field. The nurse reads the anesthesia, interprets the vitals, adjusts the blood products, coordinates the entire team around a shared objective. On the night of April 22nd, with Major Chen occupied for the first 2 hours of Robert's care, I was the clinical lead on a damage control case in a tent with one flashlight and a critically low blood supply. I controlled the hemorrhage. I managed the resuscitation. I made the call on when to pack the abdomen and close temporarily to stabilize him for transport, rather than attempting full repair in conditions that were degrading by the minute. I made that call correctly. Every call I made that night, I made correctly. Robert Mercer was alive at 04:30 when we packaged him for medevac to the Combat Support Hospital. His BP was 104/72. His GCS was 12. He was moving to the next level of care in stable condition that he had not been in 4 hours earlier, when Torres's hands had been slippery with his blood and his battalion was praying into their radios. I walked out of the tent at 04:45 to get air and to let the adrenaline metabolize before it crashed me somewhere inconvenient. The night was cold, the way Afghan nights are cold, sharp and sudden after the heat of the day. Torres was outside. He had been outside for 20 minutes, which I hadn't noticed because I had been finishing documentation and giving the handoff report for the medevac crew. He was standing with his back to the tent and his hands loose at his sides, the posture of someone who has been through something significant and is not yet sure what to do with it. He turned when he heard me. "Captain?" "Specialist." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been a combat medic for 6 years. I've been in 2 deployments. I've never seen anything like what you just did in there." I looked at him. "You controlled the bleed with no visualization, in the dark, while we were taking indirect fire. And you did it without breaking rhythm once. The whole team, the way you ran that room. I didn't understand what you people do until tonight." I nodded once. "Go get some sleep, specialist." "Yes, ma'am." He started to walk away and then turned back. "He's going to be fine, isn't he, the colonel?" "He's going to be fine," I said. I went inside and wrote it all down. Robert Mercer spent 8 days at the Combat Support Hospital and another 3 weeks at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany before he was medically evacuated back to the States. I stayed on deployment. We didn't speak until he had been home for 3 weeks and I rotated back 2 months later. My mother had told him carefully what had happened in that tent, that I was the nurse on his case, that I had managed his care for the critical first 2 hours, that the decisions I made on his hemorrhage had been assessed by Major Chen in the post-op review and rated as technically correct and clinically excellent. Robert had listened to all of this in the patient way he had of listening to information that complicated his existing framework. He had not called, not during my remaining deployment, not during my transit home. I had not expected him to. I had just kept working and kept writing things down. The conversation happened on a Tuesday evening at my mother's house. Robert had been home for 6 weeks by then, walking with a slight list from the shrapnel they hadn't been able to remove, carrying the particular stillness of someone who had spent months in medical facilities and had not fully re-inhabited the life that had been interrupted. My mother cooked dinner, the specific kind of elaborate meal she made when she was managing something emotionally complex and needed to channel it into preparation. I helped set the table. Robert sat in his usual chair. We ate and talked about things that were not what we were all thinking about. After dinner, my mother excused herself to do the dishes, which was her version of leaving us the space. Robert looked at me across the table for a moment with the expression I recognized from 5 years of knowing him. The expression of a man who understood something was required of him and was determining the precise form it should take. "I owe you an apology," he said. "For what specifically?" He was quiet for a moment, not avoiding the question, working toward the precise answer it required. "For 6 years of not understanding what you do, for calling it hospital work, for the thing I said about nurses not being real soldiers, for the assumption I never questioned because it was convenient and I'd been carrying it since before I even met you." "Okay," I said. "That's a list." "Yeah," he said. "It is." "Which part changed your mind?" "Torres," he said. "He called me from Germany, 2 days after the surgery. He'd looked you up, found your record, your deployments, your commendations. He read me your citation for the first Bronze Star. Then he told me what he watched you do in that tent. The generator going down, the blood supply running out, the way you managed everything simultaneously, the surgery and the vitals and the team and the conditions, without ever losing the thread. He said he'd never seen anyone do what you did. He said he'd trained with surgeons who couldn't do what you did. Torres is a good medic, I said. He held the flashlight steady for 2 hours in a combat zone. That matters. He said you told him to go get some sleep afterward. He needed sleep. He said that's when he knew how good you were, that after everything that happened in there, your first thought was about his rest. He looked at me directly. I spent 22 years in the army, and I never once understood that what you do requires more from a person than what I do. Not just the medicine, the way you carry it, the decisions you make and live with, the triage call. He knew about the triage call. Torres must have explained the framework. You made a decision about a patient that night, he continued. While you were managing my case, you told the medic to move that patient to expectant. Expectant. The triage category that means expected to die. The category that is not abandonment but is the hardest call medicine asks anyone to make. He wasn't survivable, I said. Not with the resources available. I know, Robert said. Torres explained it. The resources that would have been used on him would have come from my case. I understand that. He paused. I'm sitting here because you made that call correctly, and because you managed everything else in that tent correctly, and because you have been doing this for 8 years and getting better at it every deployment while I spent those same 8 years thinking you were on the safe side of the wire. I looked at him. I kept a notebook, I said. Since the first year we knew each other. Every comment, every redirect, every time you described what I do in a way that made it sound like less than what it was, I documented it. He absorbed that. Why? Because I document everything. It's how I process what's real, and because I knew eventually we'd have this conversation, and I wanted to be honest with myself about what had actually been said. Can I ask what's in it? You already know what's in it, I said. Yeah, he said. I do. He was quiet for a moment. I'm going to tell people, he said. In my battalion, at the VFW, anywhere people are still carrying the assumption I was carrying, that nurses are support, that medicine isn't combat service, because they're wrong, and I am the specific kind of evidence that makes that argument difficult to dismiss. You don't have to do that. I know I don't, I want to. He looked at me with the directness that had always been his most recognizable quality, the infantry officer's habit of saying things plainly. Thank you for saving my life, and I'm sorry it took me this long to understand what that meant. The formal recognition came in increments. Major Chen submitted me for a commendation for the April 22nd case, citing the clinical decision-making under degraded conditions, the blood product management, the generator failure adaptation, the triage decisions made simultaneously with the primary case. The commendation was approved and went into my permanent record. Torres submitted a separate written account to my commanding officer, an unsolicited after-action statement from a combat medic who wanted the record to reflect what he had observed. My commanding officer shared it with me. It was 2 pages, single-spaced, precise in its clinical detail, written by someone who understood medicine well enough to explain exactly what he had seen. He described the flashlight surgery, the blood product rationing, the moment the generator died and I kept operating without pause, the triage call and its logic. He concluded with a sentence I have never forgotten. In 6 years as a combat medic, I have trained for situations like this. I have never seen anyone trained better. That statement went into the record. It went into the lessons learned documentation for forward surgical operations in that region. It contributed to a training program development effort that would improve how FST nurses prepared for degraded condition surgery. My experience, documented and preserved, making the next person better prepared than I had been. That is the actual legacy of this work. Not the recognition, the transmission, the way one person's expertise, properly documented, becomes another person's preparation. Robert came to my promotion ceremony when I made major. He was not fully recovered from the shrapnel. He walked with the slight compensation he would probably carry for the rest of his life, the physical reminder of April 22nd written into his gait. He stood in the front row with my mother, and he watched the ceremony with the specific attention of someone who understood what they were watching now. After the ceremony, when the photographs were done and the guests were moving toward the reception, he found me alone for a moment near the edge of the room. "I told the story at the VFW last month," he said. "Which story?" "April 22nd, the whole thing. The generator, the flashlight, Torres, what you did, what I didn't understand." "How did it go?" A few of the older guys pushed back. The category that is not abandonment but is the hardest call medicine asks anyone to make. "He wasn't survivable," I said. "Not with the resources available." "I know," Robert said. Torres explained it. "The resources that would have been used on him would have come from my case. I understand that." He paused. "I'm sitting here because you made that call correctly, and because you managed everything else in that tent correctly, and because you have been doing this for 8 years and getting better at it every deployment while I spent those same 8 years thinking you were on the safe side of the wire." I looked at him. "I kept a notebook," I said. "Since the first year we knew each other. Every comment, every redirect, every time you described what I do in a way that made it sound like less than what it was. I documented it." He absorbed that. "Why?" "Because I document everything. Said nurses are nurses, that's the distinction. That's how it's always been." "And?" "I told them they were wrong the same way I was wrong, and I had the scar tissue to prove it." He said it without drama. Just a statement of fact, the way infantry sergeants reported things when they wanted you to know the information without the emotion. "One of them has a daughter in the nursing program at Fort Sam Houston. He texted me after the meeting, said he was going to call her." That was the part that mattered. Not Robert's changed mind, as important as that was. The daughter at Fort Sam Houston, entering the Army nurse pipeline with a father who now understood what she was choosing and why it mattered. The chain of understanding, one conversation at a time, the slow revision of a framework that had been wrong for decades. I went home that evening and opened the notebook. The last entry I had written was from April 22nd, 0445 hours, outside the tent in the cold Afghan night. Torres standing with his back to the tent. His exact words. I wrote one more entry below it. Date, location. Robert's statement at the VFW, the daughter at Fort Sam Houston. And then, at the bottom of the page, in the same precise handwriting I had used for every entry over 5 years, the work always speaks. You just have to give it enough time to find its voice. I am still in the Army. I am now the chief nurse of a forward surgical team, responsible for the clinical development of the nurses on my team and for the standards of care we bring to every mission. I still carry the notebook. Every deployment, every significant case, every moment when the work produces something worth documenting, not because I am building a case anymore, because documentation is how I honor the work, how I make sure the decisions I made, the good ones and the hard ones and the ones that cost me something, are recorded accurately for whatever purpose they might eventually serve. The triage call from April 22nd is in the notebook. The generator failure is in the notebook. Torres and his flashlight and his 2 pages of testimony, those are in the notebook. And alongside all of it, all the clinical data and the medical decisions and the technical details of what forward surgical nursing actually requires, are the other entries. Robert's comments over 5 years. The notebook started as documentation and became something else without my fully intending it. A record of what it costs to do invisible work without the recognition that visible work receives. A record of patience. A record of choosing the work over the argument, every single time, because the work was always going to say it better than I ever could. It said it on April 22nd at 0214 hours when the generator died and I kept my hands steady. It said it when Torres called Robert from Germany 2 days later. It said it when a VFW member texted his daughter at Fort Sam Houston to tell her he understood now what she was choosing. If you are doing work that people around you don't understand, work whose difficulty is invisible and whose importance is assumed but not acknowledged, I want you to hear this. Document it. Not out of grievance, out of respect for what you are actually doing. Because the work deserves an accurate record even when the people around you aren't keeping one. Write down the cases you managed and the decisions you made and the moments when everything was degraded and you held the line anyway. Not for an argument you're preparing to have. For the record that already exists, whether or not anyone is writing it down. And that is always more complete and more accurate when you are the one holding the pen. My stepdad called my career hospital work for 6 years. Then he lay on my operating table in a tent in Afghanistan with the generator dead and one flashlight and his blood pressure dropping, and my hands found the bleed in the dark and held it until the light came back. The work always speaks. Sometimes it just needs the right conditions to be heard. Have you ever done the hard, invisible work that someone only understood when they needed it themselves? Leave a comment and tell us your story. We share stories like this every single day, stories about expertise and patience, and the moment the work finally speaks loudly enough to change someone's mind. Subscribe and stay with us. Because the work always mattered. It just took the right moment for everyone else to hear it. What most people do not understand about the Army Nurse Corps, and what Robert Mercer did not understand for 6 years, is that the distinction between a nurse and a soldier was dissolved the moment the Army started sending nurses to forward surgical elements in combat zones. The distinction exists in the minds of people who have not watched a nurse manage a hemorrhagic shock patient under indirect fire. It does not exist on the operating table. It does not exist in the triage tent. It does not exist in the 9-person split element that sets up in a building that took mortar fire the previous afternoon and begins treating casualties the following morning, because the mission does not stop and the casualties do not stop. And the only thing standing between a wounded soldier and death is 20 people in a tent who trained for exactly this. The Army Nurse Corps has been producing combat nurses since the Civil War. Since the Second World War, Army nurses have served in every major conflict, in every environment, under every condition that combat produces. In Korea, Army nurses performed surgery within artillery range. In Vietnam, they managed mass casualty events in understaffed facilities while the base perimeter was under attack. In Iraq and Afghanistan, forward surgical nurses like me worked in conditions where the concept of a safe rear area had become largely theoretical, where a forward operating base could take rocket fire at Euro 200 and resume operations at Euro 230 because stopping was not an option anyone had. We carry weapons. We qualify annually. We take the same deployment training as the infantry soldiers we treat. The combat medical badge, the one on my uniform, is not awarded for paperwork. It is awarded for providing medical care under hostile fire. Mine has been awarded twice. I am telling you this not because I needed Robert Mercer to know it. He knows it now. I am telling you because there are people listening to this who work in roles that other people dismiss, because the dismissal is convenient, because the work is invisible, because the framework being used to evaluate the work was built before the work existed in its current form. The infantry sergeant's framework for military service was built in a world where the division between combat and support was cleaner and more defensible than it is today. He wasn't wrong that the framework existed, he was wrong that it still applied. And the cost of that wrong application was 6 years of my career being described as hospital work at dinner tables, while I was making triage calls in Afghanistan that determined who lived and who waited, and what the acceptable cost of a resource-constrained decision was. That cost accrued slowly, one dinner table conversation at a time, one redirect at a time, one comment that treated 20 surgical deployments as a pleasant career in a safe environment. I absorbed it and documented it, and did not argue because arguing was not the point. The work was the point. The work was always the point. On my 5th deployment, the one after April 22nd, I was assigned to a combat support hospital rather than a forward surgical element for the first 6 weeks. Larger facility, more resources, higher level of care. The kind of facility where Robert probably imagined I had been working all along. The surgical volume was higher. The case complexity was higher. The hours were longer. I performed or assisted in 214 surgical cases in 6 weeks, more than most civilian surgical nurses see in a year. Among those cases was a complex abdominal reconstruction on a soldier who had been managed initially by a forward surgical team and arrived at our facility with the packing still in place from their damage control surgery, ready for the definitive repair that the forward team had bought him time to receive. I looked at the initial operative note, reviewed the decisions the forward surgical nurse had made. Everything was correct, everything was precise. The packing placement, the hemorrhage control, the resuscitation management. A nurse, working in a tent, with limited resources, had kept that soldier alive long enough to get him to me. That is the chain. That is how it works. And every person in that chain, from the combat medic who applied the tourniquet in the field, to the forward surgical nurse who did the damage control, to the combat support hospital surgeon who did the definitive repair, is a soldier doing the specific part of the work that only they can do. No part of that chain is support. No part of it is hospital work. It is all the same war, viewed from different positions in the same system, and the system fails completely if any part of it fails. Robert Mercer understood this eventually. He understood it because Torres explained it from the floor of a tent at 0214 hours, with a tactical flashlight in one hand and surgical retractors in the other. Some lessons require that level of specificity to land properly. The notebook I kept for 5 years before April 22nd has a companion notebook now, started the day after that night. The new one doesn't document dismissals. It documents cases, decisions, outcomes, the technical architecture of what this work actually requires. It is the record I want to leave behind when I eventually leave the Army. The record that a future nurse might find useful when they are in a tent somewhere with a generator that is about to fail and a patient who is about to die and 12 decisions to make in 40 seconds. The decisions I made on April 22nd are in that notebook. The logic, the sequence, the specific clinical reasoning that led to each one. Because if that information helps someone make better decisions in a similar situation, then April 22nd produced something beyond Robert's survival, beyond Torres's testimony, beyond the changed conversation at a VFW meeting in a town I've never visited. It produced knowledge, and knowledge, properly documented and transmitted, outlasts everything else. That is also what nurses do. That is also what soldiers do. That is also what I do. Every deployment, every case, every entry in a notebook that started as grievance documentation and became something I am genuinely proud of. Write it down. Every decision, every difficult case, every moment when the conditions were wrong and you held the line anyway. The work deserves an accurate record, and you deserve to be the one keeping it. Let me go back to the beginning of my training, because the beginning is where the dismissal was most absurd in retrospect and where the foundation of everything that happened on April 22nd was actually built. When I entered the Army Nurse Corps, I had already completed a Bachelor of Science in Nursing, passed the NCLEX RN on my first attempt, and worked 2 years in a civilian-level Y Trauma Center emergency department. That was the baseline. The Army then put me through the basic officer course, which covered military customs and courtesies and leadership development and the administrative structure of Army medicine. Then came the Surgical Nursing Specialty Certification Program at Fort Sam Houston, which covered advanced trauma surgical nursing, perioperative care in austere environments, mass casualty triage, hemorrhage control, damage control surgery support, and the specific brutal medicine of combat wounds that civilian nursing programs do not and cannot adequately prepare you for, because the injuries are different, and the conditions are different, and the resources are different, and you need to experience the gap before you can close it. I spent 14 months becoming qualified as a forward surgical nurse before I ever deployed. 14 months of increasingly realistic simulation, cadaver labs, trauma center rotations, mass casualty exercises that put you in conditions of deliberate degradation, low light and low supplies and high patient load, and people shouting competing priorities at you simultaneously to see whether your clinical decision-making holds under pressure or whether it fractures when the conditions stop being comfortable. Mine held. It held from the first exercise through the last, and it held because I had developed something in those 2 years in the civilian trauma center that training could refine but not create from nothing. The ability to be afraid and functional simultaneously. Fear is a physiological response. It does not stop because the situation requires you to operate. What training does is create enough repetition and enough muscle memory that the fear and the function can coexist without one eliminating the other. By the time I deployed the first time, I had made 400 triage assessments in simulation, performed or assisted in 60 surgical cases under degraded conditions, and been evaluated by instructors who had done this work in actual combat and knew the difference between someone who performed well in a classroom and someone who would perform well in a tent in Afghanistan. I evaluated well. I deployed. I came back. I deployed again. Each time the skills deepened in the specific way that only actual experience deepens them. The way simulation can prepare you for the architecture of a crisis, but only the crisis itself teaches you what it actually feels like from the inside, and what adjustments you need to make between what training told you to expect and what reality delivers. By my fourth deployment, by the night Robert Mercer arrived on my operating table, I had 1,200 combat surgical cases in my record. 1,200 times I had been the nurse managing a trauma patient whose survival depended in part on the precision of my decisions and the speed of my execution. That is not a credential I display anywhere. It is not a number that comes up at dinner tables. It is not the kind of statistic that generates the stories Robert told at the VFW. But it is the number that explains why my hands were steady in the dark on April 22nd and why the 12 decisions I made in 40 seconds were the right 12 decisions. You do not arrive at steady hands in the dark through talent. You arrive there through 1,200 cases and the incremental learning each one produced and the documentation that preserved what each one taught you for the cases that came after. 1,200 cases is the answer to, how was the hospital work? It is the answer Robert never received because I was not in the habit of offering it unprompted to someone who had already decided he knew what my work involved. The mass casualty event on my second deployment deserves its own account, because it is the event that I return to most often when I think about what this work actually requires from a person. 11 simultaneous casualties from a vehicle-borne IED at a checkpoint. Our 9-person team, designed for a sustained caseload of 6 critical patients over 24 hours, receiving 11 in 40 minutes. Triage is the management of scarcity. It is the clinical process by which you allocate limited resources across a patient population whose collective need exceeds what your resources can meet, in a way that produces the best possible aggregate outcome. The word comes from the French trier, to sort. You sort. You make determinations about which patients receive priority care and which patients wait and, in the hardest cases, which patients are designated expectant, meaning that their injuries are severe enough and the resource cost of attempting salvage is high enough that the decision is made to provide comfort rather than curative intervention and direct the resources toward patients whose survival is achievable. I have made that determination 7 times in my career. 7 times I have looked at a patient and made the assessment and written the designation and moved on to the next patient and lived with what that designation meant for the one I left. 7 times. Each one documented. Each one reviewed in post-operational analysis by my senior medical officer and assessed as clinically correct. Clinically correct does not mean comfortable. Clinically correct means the decision was right, given the information available and the resources present, and the obligation to the greatest possible number of survivors. I carry all 7. I carry them the way this work requires you to carry the hard things, which is not lightly, and not by pretending they weren't hard, but alongside everything else, integrated into the record of what it has cost to do this work at the level it requires. Robert Mercer knew none of this when he sat in my mother's kitchen and called 6 deployments hospital work. He knew none of it when I came home with the 2nd Bronze Star and he shook my hand with the polite warmth of someone acknowledging an achievement they don't fully understand. He knew none of it at the dinner table over the next 5 years of my career. I did not tell him. Not out of pride, though pride was present. Out of the specific patience of someone who has learned that the people who most need to understand your work are not always the people who are ready to hear about it. Robert was not ready. His framework was fixed. His experience was 22 years of infantry service in a culture with clear hierarchies and clear definitions, and a very specific idea of what soldiering meant. Information that challenged the framework would have been filtered through the framework and emerged unchanged on the other side. The only thing that changes a fixed framework is evidence so direct and so undeniable that the framework has no mechanism for absorbing it. April 22nd was that evidence. Torres was that evidence. A man lying on an operating table in his own blood, in the dark, in the care of the nurse he had underestimated for 6 years. That is the evidence that changed Robert Mercer's mind, and it changed it completely, and it changed it in a way that made him useful to other people who needed their minds changed, which is the best possible outcome of any conversion. Not private transformation. Public. The VFW story. The phone call that reached a daughter at Fort Sam Houston. The chain of understanding that runs forward from one honest conversation into futures that neither the speaker nor the listener can fully see from where they're standing. I want to say one more thing about Torres because Torres deserves his own paragraph in any account of that night. Specialist Marcus Torres was 24 years old on April 22nd. He had been a combat medic for 3 years and had never seen forward surgical operations from the inside. He was in that tent because his battalion commander was in that tent, and he was not going to be anywhere else. For 2 hours, he held a flashlight over a surgical field in a tent that was receiving indirect fire and handed instruments when asked, and maintained the retraction that kept the operative field visible and did not once waver or question or require management. What Torres did that night was also courage. Quiet, technical, sustained courage that does not look like anything in the stories at VFW meetings, but that mattered completely to every decision I made in those 2 hours. The flashlight beam never moved unless I needed it to move. The retraction was maintained with the consistency of someone who understood that a single lapse in concentration could cost the patient on the table. Torres was not trained for forward surgical support. He was trained for battlefield medicine at the company level. He adapted. He observed what was needed and he provided it without being asked twice for anything. When he submitted that written account to my commanding officer, he was not performing. He was doing exactly what he had done in the tent, observing precisely and reporting accurately and making sure the record reflected what actually happened. I am grateful for Torres in the way you are grateful for people who show up completely when everything is wrong and do the specific thing required without making it about themselves. That is also a skill. That is also courage. That is also worth writing down. The notebook is on my desk right now. The current one, not the original 5-year record of Robert's comments and my documentation of them. The one that started on April 23rd, the day after the night that changed everything. It has entries from 3 deployments in it now, cases and decisions and outcomes and moments worth preserving. The original notebook is in a box in my closet. I have not thrown it away, and I will not throw it away, because it is the accurate record of a specific period in my life and in my relationship with a man who has since become something different from what he was, not a different person. The same person with a corrected framework, which is the best version of change that adults are realistically capable of producing in themselves. He corrected his framework. He then worked to correct the frameworks of people around him. That is all anyone can ask. That is enough. The work spoke. The notebook was ready when it needed to be. And I am still here, still deploying, still writing things down, still holding the line in whatever tent or building or vehicle the mission requires. That is the whole story, and also only part of it because the work is not finished, and the notebook is not full. Write it down. Every case, every decision, every difficult night when you held the line in the dark, and nobody was watching but you and the work. It deserves the record. You deserve to be the one keeping it. One last thing, because it is part of the record and belongs here. 2 months after Robert's recovery, my mother told me that he had started attending the family readiness group meetings at the installation. The FRG, for those who don't know, is the support network for military families during deployments. Spouses and parents and siblings of deployed soldiers meeting together to share information and provide support during the absences that military service requires. Robert had never attended when I was deployed. He attended now. He had introduced himself at the first meeting by saying he was the stepfather of Captain Sarah Mercer, and that he was there because he hadn't understood what his stepdaughter's service involved until recently, and he was trying to correct that. He had sat and listened for 2 hours. He had gone back the following month. My mother reported this to me with the particular quiet satisfaction of a woman who had watched two people she loved fail to understand each other for 6 years and was watching them find their way to something better. I wrote it down. Not in the grievance notebook. In the current one, the one that started on April 23rd. Because it belongs in the record of what the work produced, not just the survival, not just the surgery, not just the changed mind, the changed behavior, the man who attended the meetings, the chain that runs forward. That is the whole record, and it is still being written, and I am still the one holding the pen. There is a version of this story where I confronted Robert earlier, where I sat him down in my mother's kitchen in year 2 and walked him through the deployments and the Bronze Stars and the mass casualty events and the triage calls, and made him understand through argument what he eventually understood through experience. I tried that version in my head many times over 5 years. It never ended well in any version I imagined, not because Robert was unreasonable, because the argument would have been about definitions, about what counts as soldiering and what doesn't, and that argument has no resolution in the abstract. It only resolves in a tent at 0214 hours with the generator dead, and a man who thought he understood military service lying on a table, learning in real time how much he did not understand. I could not manufacture that moment. I could only prepare for it, stay ready for it, keep doing the work at the level the work required, so that when the moment arrived, I was the person the moment needed me to be. That is the whole instruction. Be so good at the work that when the moment comes, the work speaks without you having to. My stepdad called me a hospital nurse for 6 years. Then the hospital came to him, in a tent, in the dark, in the middle of a firefight, and the nurse he had underestimated was already inside the wire and already scrubbing in and already making the calls that kept him alive to change his mind. You cannot write that ending in advance. You can only earn it.